Today we have the fourth Sunday of Lent, and it starts out with that idea of divine retribution. They see the man born blind. They said, okay, who sinned? Did his parents sin or did he sin? And you see the idea of divine retribution, especially early on in the Hebrew scriptures. We see that. We see the idea that God will, even though somebody might be doing quite well and everything looks good, but they're opposed to God. They cheat. They do all these kind of evil things. That God will eventually get back to them, and they will find their comeuppance. They'll find their way back down the ladder. But really, when we think about it, it's really rare situation that we see that idea of divine retribution. I remember one time back in the early 1990s, I was on Route 66 in Virginia, going from Front Royal back to the city. And what happened was there was a car, and I went, oh my gosh. And I got out of the way as fast as I could to the other lane. I was in the left lane. I got to the right lane. This guy was barreling by at about 100 and some miles an hour. And I said, where's the cop when you all this kind of stuff. And so finally, somewhere before you got to Manassas, he had gotten pulled over by the police. And so the reason why, even though this is from early 1990s, the reason why I remember it is how rare divine retribution is. It really is a rare thing when somebody does something that's horribly wrong, whether they're weaving in and out of traffic, and you say, well, or the guy is obviously impaired in their driving, and they're driving all over the road, and but they don't get caught. But in that case, they did. But that's a rare situation. But you see, what happened is that while even though that idea of divine retribution was becoming less and less within the ideas of the people, we had that idea of a final judgment, that idea of a final judgment. We do see that idea that sometimes it does stick around. Okay, who sinned, him or his parents? So we see, even though they had that idea of the final judgment, that they still had that idea of divine retribution. So Jesus comes, he puts clay into the ground, kind of invoking that idea of, as God formed man out of the clay of the earth, reforming, Jesus redoing creation which fell, now being recreated by Christ. We see that in there was a website called Crafted Preaching, which talks about that, which was a good point. And so we have the person's being questioned. He's questioned by the neighbors. And he says the man Jesus is the one who did this. Then he's questioned by the Pharisees, and he said, I think he's a prophet. And so whenever you have that idea of newness, whenever you have that idea of breaking that status quo, sometimes you're going to get people in opposition. So somebody who's been, drinking, carousing, doing all these kind of things, all of a sudden they find Christ, and all of a sudden they're changed. But you're going to have some who will certainly applaud that. But you're also going to have some who will be non-accepting of that. And so the one thing that's important in life is to find those good friends, those friends who will support you in your good decisions and not try to undermine your good decisions. So again, that idea that the people saw that and were in opposition to him. And then he said he opened the eyes of the blind. Now, one of the things that we see in the prophet Isaiah, in Isaiah 35, verses 5 and 6, is that idea that the Messiah will indeed open the eyes of the blind. There certainly were many miracles by the prophets. We think about the miraculous feeding of Elisha. Elijah fed the 100, and a miraculous feeding in the book of Kings. We also think of Elijah, who was able to raise the son of the woman, the widow of Zarephath. He was able to raise the son from the dead. So we see these, but the one thing we don't see is that idea that the person is going to open the eyes of the blind. But in Jesus, we see that. And so one of the things that when he faces that opposition from the Pharisees, from the religious leaders, he worships him as the Messiah. And this really comes back to that idea of, the woman at the well. The woman at the well starts out with, how can you, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan, for a drink? So Jew then talks about living water, then says, sir, can I have this living water that I won't have to come back here time and time again? Then he talks about her having 5 husbands. The one she's living with is not her husband. She calls him a prophet. And then finally, the Messiah. So we see that progression. We see that progression here from the idea of the man Jesus, a prophet, to worshiping him as the Messiah. And we see the man who is born blind not only physically healed, but spiritually healed. Whereas the Pharisees, who had the great knowledge, who were great people of knowledge about the law and knew quite a lot about that and meticulously practiced the law, they were the ones in the end who were blind. Thanks, and God bless.